day after the union budget, experts and economists are still sifting through the fine print to get an overview of did the budget actually deliver on its promises of growth to a country that really needs to speed up the recovery process. Now, to speak on the budget, I am joined today by top economist, a former member of the Prime Minister's Economic A day after the union budget, experts and economists are still sifting through the fine print to get an overview of did the budget actually deliver on its promises of growth to a country that really needs to speed up the recovery process. Now, to speak on the budget, I am joined today by top economist, a former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and Managing Director of ODI, Rathin Roy. Rathin, great to have you on the show and looking forward to this conversation a day after the budget, once the noise has settled down and the instant analysis has sort of gone away and replaced with a deeper look at the numbers. So, having said that, let me begin with your overview. Do you agree with the broad consensus that is emerging that this budget very courageously avoided the temptation of being an election budget coming ahead of 5 state elections and has really pushed for growth with a huge increase in capital expenditure?
No, I do not agree. First, as far as the state elections are concerned, this budget comes too late. Other than to act as a signaling device to people, and I think given the negative economic circumstances people have gone through in the states where this election is going to happen, signaling would not have done the job. What had to be done early, which is why this budget has been conspicuously silent on things like farm support, etc. It is in the 23-24 budget that you could legitimately expect to see any sort of election budget. State elections also are not that influenced by central budgets. And finally, I'm afraid the ruling party has other ways of garnering electoral support. They're not in the business of garnering electoral support through economic performance, obviously. That's as far as avoiding electoral populism goes. When it comes to public investment, I want to basically perhaps appeal to your readers to understand with me some very basic economics. A contractionary budget cannot promote growth because it contracts government activity. The idea when the whole economy is contracting is for government to expand its activity as far as possible so that they can make up for the fact that other consumption, investment, etc. by the private sector contracted. Now, this budget has contracted. I don't know why people can't see this. It is quite amusing. It has contracted by 1.5%, by which I mean it is 1.5% of GDP smaller than the FY 2021 budget. FY 21-22 RE expenditure GDP ratio is 1.5% less than the previous year. So, a contractionary budget, firstly, cannot be a pro-growth budget. You're spending less. Now comes this argument about public investment. Yes, it is absolutely true that public investment outlays have been increased. Let me first point out that public investment outlays that were increased in 22-23, you have to deduct a large amount of the Air India liability from that. Even so, it is clear that these outlays to public investment are significantly higher. I would say between 2018-19 and now, almost a percentage of GDP higher than they were earlier. But this increase in public investment outlay has not come in the way that you would expect it to have an immediate macroeconomic impact. So what normally happens is you increase government revenues, you use those government revenues to maintain your recurrent or revenue expenditures, you then borrow more to invest. That's what happened. The government has failed to mobilize as much as 1 lakh crores through disinvestment receipts, which has not been made up by the slightly better performance in taxation. Therefore, expenditure has shrunk by 1.3%, and overall expenditure has shrunk, but since public investment as a share has risen, it means it has risen at the expense of revenue expenditure. So it's not higher taxes financing higher public spending. That's an expansionary budget. It's higher public investment and lower revenue expenditure. Now, what is it in lower revenue expenditure that the government has cut? Not subsidies. They're higher than, they're actually slightly higher than they were 3 years ago as a percentage of GDP. Not committed expenditure, which is the cost of running the government and interest payments. Those are 1% higher as a percentage of GDP than they were last year. So what the government has cut are welfare expenditures. They have cut expenditures on Narega. And to my utter shock, the total expenditure on health as a percentage of GDP after the pandemic is lower than it was before the pandemic. That's a hugely broken promise. I thought we had committed from the pandemic that we were going to be spending more on healthcare. The idea was not just to spend enough to vaccinate people during the pandemic and then go back to the third-class healthcare systems, public healthcare systems that we had. I thought we were going to invest in healthcare and that was going to be a growth sector. That has not happened. They have cut that, they have cut education, they have cut rural development, they have cut almost every developmentally beneficial revenue expenditure. And then you have this extra public investment. Now, what is the hope from this public investment? That it will increase growth? How? When you build a highway, it gives you a growth impact, but that highway has to somehow spur the private sector to invest more. Now, what the private sector has done, at least the listed companies has done, as you know perfectly well, during the pandemic is they have made more profits by producing less output. GDP has fallen, but their profits have gone up, which means their output sales have been less, but their profits have gone up. Why should they invest? Just because you're building roads and highways. So a contractionary budget, no guarantee or no logic which tells me that this public investment is going to stimulate private investment. How can we possibly call this a pro-growth budget? It's a budget where the government has failed in its basic duty to mobilize revenues and then use those to increase spending. And no such budget that is contractionary as a consequence of this failure can be described as pro-growth. Simple economics.
So the argument that is coming in, and some would argue that the government has managed to present a very prudent budget at a time when there is a hit of a pandemic still hovering on the economy. It's hitting revenues, it's hit disinvestment as well, and they want to move back on the path of fiscal consolidation and stick to their targets. That's why they've overshot marginally, 6.8%, they've overshot by 6.9%, they're sticking to their 4.5% fiscal deficit target for 25-26. And in that sense, they have been more conservative.
Yeah, but you can't have it both ways. I know. Luckily, I don't work for FICCI, so I don't have to praise the government for fear that the ED will be on my house tomorrow. But really, I mean, okay, you can praise the government, but at least be consistent. It's either a conservative budget, which means that you're shrinking the state, that cannot be pro-growth at a time of recession, or it's a pro-growth budget. Now, as far as conservatism is concerned, no. Fiscal deficit has gone down to 6.9%, which is more than 6.8. So firstly, the government has slipped its target. People can be very kind and say, oh, they've slipped very little, but the slippage is a slippage. And that slippage has also come with a shrunken budget. It has not come because the government has spent more. The government has spent less and yet slightly missed its fiscal deficit target because the government has failed in the primary duty of every government, which is to collect the taxes it says it will collect and to resource mobilize the way it would. They have failed that massively by 1 lakh crores. Now, I heard excuses last night on another channel from somebody I really respect, Jayan Sinha, saying, oh, it's very difficult to disinvest. Did you know that last year? Are you school children? After all, you're sitting there, you're at the highest levels of the land, and you're coming up with a 1,50,000 crore target. You miss it not by 10 or 20,000 crores. You miss it by 1 lakh crores. What does that tell me about the competency of the finance ministry? And now I know that they're incompetent because this year they have moderated that target from 1,75,000 crores to 68,000 crores. They have moderated their tax target. So what are they saying? We are not competent to raise revenues that would permit us to increase expenditures and borrow less. Therefore, what we are going to do is, commit to raising fewer revenues because we are not competent. We are going to cut expenditures and shrink the budget. And that's how we are going to meet the fiscal consolidation target. That's a highly undesirable state of affairs.
No, so if someone was taking a charitable view of this, Rathin, they could say that they are being realistic about what can be achieved and not window dressing numbers like has been done in budgets through the years. Would that be also another way of looking at it, you think?
I think that's a very good way of looking at it, except I would say that what they're then doing is admitting to their own long-term incompetence. What is so difficult for an average private finance ministry that is committed to disinvest something, to disinvest it? Why has it taken them so long to move on LIC? Why didn't they appoint their transactions advisor only last July? What is taking them so long to engage in banking disinvestment? Why has it taken them 7 years to privatize Air India? So yes, if the government is saying, oh God, we were bluffing you, we were pretending we were a competent finance ministry, now what you're seeing on track record is we're extremely incompetent finance ministry. We are not a test team, we are India's C team. And therefore we are now going to moderate our targets. Please lower expectations from the government. We are going to shrink the state, we are going to collect less revenue, and we're going to try and manage fiscal prudence. Fine. But please do not dress that up as a landmark budget. It's very frightening if the finance minister says that this is a budget that's going to guide us for the next 25 years. And that means the same level of incompetence I'm seeing, making them moderate their targets, I'm going to see for the next 25 years. That is not acceptable to me. An incompetent finance ministry that is honest about its incompetence is only the first step. I expect competence from the finance ministry. And I expect them to raise tax GDP ratios. I expect them to follow through more efficiently and effectively on disinvestment. And not just lower their targets saying, oh, we can't do it. We were fooling you all the time. This year we are being realistic. No brownie points for me from that. They're not paid to be incompetent.
So let me talk about the bit where a vision has been laid out in the budget, because the budget is very often a signal of intent as well. And they've talked about what they want to do over the next 25 years. They've talked about the push on infrastructure. There's a Gati Shakti scheme. There's a push for green energy bonds. Do you find merit in some of those announcements that have been made? Are they in the right direction?
All the announcements that were made, except the one on crypto rupee, which I don't understand, don't want to discuss. I think everyone has wasted a lot of time on it yesterday. I think it's a smoke screen. But when it comes to the rest, yeah, it's good to be green. It's good to promote infrastructure. But you're talking about a government that said they would raise 1,75,000 crores of disinvestment, which is fully within their control. Huh? They own those assets. And they have failed to do more than 1/3 of that. So how do you expect me to credibly believe that such an incompetent finance ministry is going to deliver on the big talk they're doing now on something else? When their core business they can't do. Their core business is to raise taxes. Not raise taxes according to what I want. Raise taxes to the level that they said they would. When they came to office, they said they would raise taxes at 8% plus. Every year they pretended they were going to raise taxes at 8% plus, and they fell flat on their face. Now they're got into the business of under-targeting. Then they said, oh, suddenly they became great converts to disinvestment. We are going to disinvest, and that's going to be the magic grail. The fundamental job of a government, Tamanna, is to be credible about the money it will raise and then how it will spend it. Talk is cheap. I've heard enough talk from this government for the last 7 years, and I'm getting a bit fed up. So now to pretend this is an expansionary budget, or it will be an expansionary budget.
Okay. So, yeah. No, so since you are being very honestly, brutally critical of this government's budget, allow me to play devil's advocate.
Yes.
Do you think that they deserve a bit of leeway, considering they have been trying to disinvest during a pandemic, when the situation has been tough. Global conditions have been tough. And they needed to have presented a budget which gave them a bit of leeway, not knowing what's coming next. You don't know whether there's going to be another wave. You don't know where crude prices are going to head. You don't know what is going to be the situation with the Fed increasing interest rates. So they have sort of hedged their bets.
A competent finance, let me ask you a question. That is a very good point you made. In February 1, 2021, there was a pandemic. And even this finance ministry sitting in North Block knew there was a pandemic, presumably they read the papers. Therefore, when they were claiming that they would disinvest 1,75,000 crores, they knew that there was a pandemic and the situation would be difficult. And yet they said they would do 1,75,000 crores. A finance ministry's word carries some credibility. Finance ministries live and die on the basis of the credibility of their pronouncements. And to miss that target by such a large margin, I'm afraid I cannot give them leeway for that. I expect my finance ministry to be more professional and more credible. And then now to give up the ghost. And all that big talk about privatization, do you not remember last year, National Asset Monetization Pipeline, list of privatized entities, big talk from Niti Aayog, big talk from the Prime Minister's office, all talk. We are left at the end of the day, finance ministry's credibility depends on the numbers. Numbers are, you did 75,000, actually that is negative because then you have to take on, even that wretched Air India, to privatize that, they have to take on a lot of the liabilities on budget. Okay? So in those circumstances, what leeway am I going to give? Now you look forward. The worst part is, if you ask anybody in the government of India today, and I think I'm entitled to these basic questions from the government, I think they've become very soft or very unambitious in this country. Last I heard, this was a proud country, not a country on its knees. Is there anybody in the finance ministry, the Prime Minister's office or Niti Aayog who can give me a reasoned argument to the following questions? What is India's GDP going to be in 2025? What is the tax structure going to be? What is going to be the share of manufacturing? What is going to be our current account deficit? And then work back from that. They have abandoned providing the medium-term macroeconomic framework for the last 2 years in the budget. So nobody knows what the medium-term path is. There's no point saying $5 trillion, $5 trillion. That though, yesterday the chief economic advisor also said that depends on the exchange rate. That's just silly. That's like a communist. $5 trillion. It's a meaningless target. What is the structure of the economy going to be? Where are we going to be in 5 years? The finance ministry has no view. They're winging it. So if they're winging it, then how do I know whether so what are they saying? We don't know where oil prices are going to be. We don't know what the growth is going to be. We don't know what inflation is going to be. We don't know whether the pandemic will come back. It's your job to take calls on these things. That is what you're paid to do when you take charge of the government of India. The job is not to say, I don't know and I'm going to wing it every month. Imagine if our generals did that when they fought a war. War has a fog too. The economy is uncertain. The skill of running a government and economic administration lies in taking on those certainties and taking calls on them, not to abdicate your responsibility, as this finance ministry has done. And I'm deeply upset about this. First through big talk, which they were not able to fulfill, and now by running away and recusing themselves from the responsibility of running an expansionary government and taking some responsibility for a medium-term growth path going forward. Did you notice in the budget, there was not a word on inflation. If you look at the nominal growth numbers, you would think that inflation is going to be, 2 or 3%. The central bank has been saying exactly the opposite to us. The numbers are saying exactly the opposite to us. Not a word from the Ministry of Finance. Why? Because they don't know how to calculate inflation. So you see, I'm saying that they're not doing their basic job. It's very serious.
Right. No, so what would you have done differently? And few bullet points on that. So you've talked about disinvestment and how you're disappointed that the disinvestment target was not only missed but lowered later. You're disappointed that inflation was not really addressed in any real way. You're saying it was not an expansionary budget. You're actually spending less this year. Your targets for tax collection are also lower. So what would you have done in 2 or 3 lines very differently?
Very simply, I would have immediately committed to a much higher rate of profit taxation than has been done in this budget. Big companies in Bombay are making windfall profits and going debt-free. That is not good for the economy. I think there is scope to raise the tax GDP ratio there, number one. Number two, I would have set out a detailed timetable blueprint for disinvestment of at least 2 banks, end of line for LIC, and Coal India. I would have done all that homework before doing the budget. I wouldn't be sleeping in North. And I would have presented a very detailed disinvestment battle plan given the failure last year to restore credibility in the government's capacity to undertake disinvestment. Right? That would have, of course, involved the government taking the private sector into confidence, coming and talking to smart people in Bombay, even deferring to them. I know our babus are not used to doing that. They think they know everything. They have no capacity in there. Niti Aayog goes around, like some kind of Renaissance gentleman, one day doing artificial intelligence, one day something else. So they told them, get serious. We need to get 150,000 crores next year into this budget so we can start spending money properly on public investment. I would have put far more public investment into agriculture, urbanization, the built environment. I would have said that we are shrinking our budget, but what we are going to do is reduce cesses and increase the share of shareable taxes, and not make the 100,000 crores that has been given to the states conditional on their undertaking stuff with the Prime Minister's picture on it. Basically, that's what they've done. Just like we had no choice but to get vaccinated without getting the PM's picture. They've been told you'll only get that 1 lakh crores if you do public investment the way we want you to do it. That's what I mean by PM's picture. I would have been more cooperative in my federalism. I would have, there are so many things I could have done. Good Lord, where do I end? I would have imposed an immediate moratorium if money is so tight on all increases in government salaries and pensions going forward. And most important, therefore, I would have given a roadmap over the next 3 or 4 years as to when we go down to a 4% fiscal deficit, how tax GDP ratios are going to make up for that, and how disinvestment proceeds are going to make up for that. I would have had a medium-term fiscal framework presented on the 1st of February along with the budget. That framework, not just a fiscal consolidation thing with one number, which is the fiscal deficit, is what would have formed the blueprint of my recovery strategy. And that would have therefore involved taking a bet on what the growth rate is going to be 4 years down and what the current account deficit is going to be 4 years down. That's the job the finance minister used to do once upon a time, and that is a job they've stopped doing. I want them to go. I would have gone back to doing the job that our finance minister used to do 10 years ago and has stopped doing for the past 10 years. That is what I would have done.
Well, that's quite a bold and a clear critique of the budget from yesterday, and it's always great to have a slew of voices and different points of view coming in on such an important policy announcement. Thank you again, as always, Rathin, for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Daman.